The Hunt-class destroyers owed their existence to pretty much the same naval officer who was responsible for the Flower class, namely the poor chap who suddenly realised that as war was looming, the Royal Navy had nowhere near enough escorts, or rather nowhere near enough destroyers, to do escort jobs. Compared to contemporary Royal Navy fleet destroyers, there were a number of changes that needed to be made. Firstly, the ships were supposed to escort convoys, and so their primary attackers would be aircraft and submarines, not surface ships, and so torpedo tubes could be deleted. Likewise, due to their primary gun role being against aircraft, the 4.7-inch guns found on British destroyers at the time could be downrated to 4-inch guns, the lighter shells of these guns being compensated for by the fact that the twin 4-inch mount could maintain a far higher rate of fire and could elevate much higher than the contemporary 4.7-inch gun. Speed was also under consideration, since the ships would not have to keep up with a fleet, but rather a relatively slow merchant convoy. A slower speed was also acceptable. It wasn't going to be quite as slow as the 16 knots of the Flower class, as it was desired that the ships would be able to chase down submarines and return to the convoy, and there may be fast enemy attackers coming in such as E-boats, which meant that the ships had to go for a slightly higher top speed, settling at just over 27 knots, which was still something of a come down from the 35 to 36 knots of fleet destroyers and resulted in much less machinery being needed. All of these changes would result in a ship that should carry 6 4-inch guns in 3 twin mounts, 2 forward, 1 aft, a single quad 40mm pom-pom, 2 20mm Oerlikons, and 40 depth charges, with 1 deployment rack at the back and 2 depth charge throwers up front. They were designed primarily for work in coastal waters and shallow seas, and so their hull shape also did not have to be particularly deep, as they were not expected to make oceanic crossings. This also meant that a lower range could be settled for, and thus less fuel, with a total maximum range at 15 knots of 3,500 nautical miles. This all allowed the design to come in at 1,000 tons standard load and about 1,350 tons full load, which was about the same displacement as a mid-World War I destroyer, but compared to the 1,800 to 2,000 ton designs that were common across most navies at the start of World War II, they were fairly small ships. Several dozen ships were ordered quickly, and as they began to complete, it began to become rapidly apparent that one of the major problems with rush job programs was coming about. Namely, someone had been a little bit too generous when they were calculating the ship's overall weight, and they were completing about 70 to 100 tons over. Now, on a battleship, 70 to 100 tons overweight would be a mark of remarkably good accuracy in estimations, and even on a cruiser it wouldn't be too bad. On a 1,000-ton escort destroyer, however, this represented almost 10% of the ship's overall standard displacement and was making them dangerously top-heavy. Almost immediately, therefore, the ships had to lose one of their twin 4-inch guns and have extra ballast added to ensure they didn't just roll over in the first major wave they came across. These ships would then become known as the Type 1 group. By adding 2.5 foot to the beam, it was found that the stability problems could be cured, so ships that hadn't yet been laid down were reordered to this new specification, becoming the Type 2 group, which was about 50 tons heavier on standard loading and about 70 tons heavier on full loading. This allowed the reinstatement of the missing 4-inch twin gun mount and the increase in the number of depth charges from 40 to 110. The next batch, or Type 3s, were ordered specifically for work escorting convoys in the Mediterranean, where it was thought that due to the enclosed nature of the sea, plus the fact the Italian Navy was significantly larger and more active than the Kriegsmarine at the time, that it was more likely that small Italian raiders, in the form of destroyers and light cruisers, might well be encountered by the convoy escorts, and so one of the turrets was deleted in favour of a twin torpedo launcher, just to give them that little bit of extra anti-surface punch. And lastly, there were the Type 4s. There were only 2 of these ships, and it's arguable that these may not count as Hunt class since they were actually built to a completely different design, which had been submitted for the original Hunt class design competition. But, oh well, there they are. These ships were slightly larger, displacing 1,175 tons standard and about 1,550 tons fully loaded, had about the same speed, but were a little bit shorter ranged. Thanks to their greater displacement, they were able to carry the originally designed full Hunt armament of 6 4-inch guns, a quad 40mm pom-pom, and two 20mm, but additionally were also able to carry 4 50 caliber machine guns, which were later replaced by 20mm Oerlikons, along with a triple torpedo tube amidships. Their superstructure was also noted to afford the crew a great amount of cover in rough weather, which made them very popular. They would give good service escorting convoys off the British coast as well as in the Mediterranean and through the Arctic, but at the end of the war the vast majority of them would be rapidly decommissioned and scrapped, as similarly with the Flower class, they were one of the early war solutions to the escort problem, and thus more modern ships had supplanted them by the time the war ended.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.